what are your preferred or your favorite ways in which you can provide access to external apps to your Kubernetes cluster? So I think for that we can hear from each of you what's your sauce.
Should I go first?
Sure.
The first alphabetical order. Well, I don't know. I just presented about Linkerd, so I would go for Service Mesh or Linkerd or those kind of things.
All right. What about you guys?
One approach I would take for on-premise cluster is there is something called as, because the challenge with on-prem cluster is the DNS. So usually when you define your Kubernetes service as a load balancer, or you were to define some kind of an ingress, this is not automatic. So in an on-premise cluster, you basically have your own DNS and so on and so forth. So one approach is that gets challenging to give an access to basically to ingress all the traffic from an outside world into the Kubernetes cluster. So one approach, what I found useful was Metal LB. You can take a look. It's an open source project from Google. So that was my approach when I did try to do ingress traffic into an on-prem cluster. So this has nothing to do with the cloud. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Jukka, what about you?
Yes. Well, the thing is, I don't think I have a standard one true way of doing this. Like Toni was earlier explaining about the way we do it at Montel via Rancher. And if I was working in Montel cluster that is suitable for this, I would use the same method. That would be like my first thing that comes to mind. I would just like to add something because of course the main thing we are talking about is how to get an endpoint in the web that is accessible and that you can, for example, serve your application or API from. But often we get situations where we just want the access to ourselves, or let's say a team member, or for whatever reason we don't need to do the full shebang of having a nice domain name with an URL, and we don't need to have a TLS certificate. In that case, we can just use the simple kube control port forward for our own debugging, or we can use cluster IP type of service. No, sorry, not cluster IP, external IP or whatever it's called, in which case you just expose an endpoint at the IP address of a node, which is usually far faster to do if your purpose is just simple debugging or providing something for your teammate to look at.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a bit more compromising in a way, like you're exposing not only the workload or not only the corresponding endpoint, but you're exposing the actual whole node. So yes, as you said, just for the debugging purposes, it works fine.
No, I mean, usually the node itself is generally exposed. It has its own external IP. It just doesn't have publicly accessible ports necessarily. This just means that you open one port to one workload.
Oh yeah, well, you make it accessible, yeah.
Well, I could comment of course, it depends really where you run your cluster. So if you are on big cloud provider, there might be kind of standard ways of doing it. But as we have been running clusters, for example, smaller cloud providers, and there's not so much infra around you that you can use. So I have come up with these 3 projects that will work anywhere, but maybe not make most sense when you are using, for example, in Google cluster. But okay, so first thing is the DNS. As I mentioned already, the external DNS is there to expose your node IPs to a given name. That is the first part, that get the traffic in. Then there is a really nice project which is Nginx Ingress, which just is driving Nginx in one container and just converting your ingress definitions into Nginx configuration. That is the second part. And the third part is the certificate manager. So you get everything to HTTPS. So combining these three, and if they are correctly installed in your cluster, the developer can just make ingress and have two annotations. One is for DNS name and one is for that I want certificate for this. And after a few minutes, you have an endpoint exposed to the world with certificate already done.
Yeah, and that one brings a bit more, how to say, more like power, or like more, it makes the developer more productive, so then you don't rely on having an ops person giving you an ingress every time you need it, but it's so easy to configure that any developer can just, of course, carefully create their own ingresses and just manage it themselves.
Of course, if you type the domain something really weird, of course, the configuration is there that you can only provision names from Montel domain or Montel.care domain in our case. But anyway, it's really nice, at least for development and these kind of operations. Really nice setup with these three projects. I think they are all CNCF projects, by the way.
Probably, Anni, you can confirm. But we have another comment from Arslan. He's one of our Monteliers, and he's suggesting that for quick debugging, the port forwarding it's a good option, or directly updating the host files with the public IP and the domain if the external DNS is quite slow. So where there's a will, there's a way. So everyone has their own like tiny tricks, and well, those are our experts' recommendations.